Hey, so today I'm going to talk about giving birth at home because this past week I've done a lot of research on that. And that's for a number of reasons. One, I never ever wanted to give birth at a hospital. Um, my last birth, for me, what made the most sense was to go to a birth center. I was under the impression I was amongst midwives who would be more likely to do and let me do exactly what I wanted. I'd also be in a nice, the birth center that we have. It's kind of like this nice Victorian home that's right next to a hospital, which also made my husband much happier because he would love to be much closer to medical help if needed. And I'll get to that experience in a second. But I never necessarily wanted to do a home birth, primarily because I don't really love my house. Now, we're doing a lot of different work to it recently, but it's still not probably my dream home where I could see myself. There's not some crazy big jacuzzi anywhere. It's a pretty small house. All the rooms are pretty small. So they're just, I've never necessarily felt like, oh, being at home is the best experience ever. And that was one of the reasons why I chose to go with the birth center. Now, what ended up happening was I found throughout the process that I had less choice than I wanted. And the midwives that I was working with, they were all fantastic, but they didn't necessarily want to adhere to a lot of the things that I wanted to do. So for example, just when it comes to, getting that glucose test, no matter what, I had to do that, where I know some places, even hospitals, they can be a little bit more flexible. But if I wanted to get birth in the birth center, I had to specifically drink that drink that basically has tons of stuff that's really awful for you. When it comes to all of the tests, when it comes to ultrasounds, if that's anything that you're even questioning whether or not you wanted to do, at least the birth center that I gave birth at, that was not allowed. Now, during my actual birth, my big problem was I was going to be late. I was going to go to 42 weeks. And granted, I was also almost ready to go, but I could not give birth at the birth center after 42 weeks. So I was going to have to be induced. That's not something I wanted. I had them sweep my membranes. That caused my water to break. Now I only have 24 hours to give birth. So that ended up causing me to also be induced. So ultimately, I ended up doing more labor at the hospital than I would have wanted. At the very last minute, I did get to be transferred to the birth center. But, again, that just wasn't the experience I wanted. But even then, right? So now I'm in the birth center. They have the tub ready. My dream was to, give birth in the tub. Nope, that's not what they wanted. They basically said, okay, you're in transition, time to get out of the tub, and we're going to push. We're going to push on the bed, and you have to be on your back. I was like, well, I don't want to be on my back. I wanted to be on the tub. And these are just things that all of the things that I had wanted as far as my dream birth, it was still a whole bunch of people telling me what I could and couldn't do. So I ended up birthing on my back. I ended up, I wanted to wait for your baby because your baby ultimately knows to find your way up to its boob on its own and, feed when it's ready. And it was just like, oh, no, here it is. He's forced to do this right now. So it was very much most likely in a lot of senses, a hospital birth, just in a really in a much nicer environment. That being said, I still did really love the midwives that I went to, but I still felt a lot of the things that are not necessarily why people go to birth centers. There were definitely things that were happening to me that I did not want, and I did regret that afterwards. Now, this past week, I've done, like I said, a lot of research on home births. In fact, studies even show that babies born at home have more diverse beneficial bacteria. So even when it comes to vaginal births at a hospital versus vaginal births at home, the babies born at home have a much better gut, and that can determine their health in future years. So for this birth, I am definitely going to do a home birth. So throughout my looking into, do I really want to do this? Do I not? I have interviewed a few different home birth midwives. What I found is one thing that I was definitely not, I was expecting to pay out of pocket. But I also thought that it would be almost like an out-of-network expense according to insurance. And at least that would be applied to a deductible or something like that. No, at least with most insurance, home birth is not covered at all. So that is going to be 100% out-of-pocket expense. And from what I've read, it runs between around $3,000 to $9,000, depending on where you are, I imagine. The two places that I talked to, it was around $4,000 or $5,000. So that is something that I will probably just plan to pay out of pocket. The other thing I found was that testing does tend to be covered. So any ultrasounds you get, all of the blood tests, all of that stuff is covered under insurance. However, the rest is not. So that's just something to think about and plan for if that is a route that you're going. The other thing that you need to think about is, your risk level. Some midwives obviously aren't going to be able to take high risk births. So, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart complications, blood clotting complications. If the placenta is being blocked, that's, a big problem. When it comes to breech births, some midwives are comfortable doing it and have done it before. Some have not. Usually most home birth midwives will bring a tub. So that's great if that's something that you are looking to do, a home birth of sorts. So it really depends on what you're looking for. One of the things that I definitely think that you should do if you're considering this is call some of the midwives in your area. And just talk to them. Come up with a list of questions and find out what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with. One of the groups of midwives that I called, and I'll probably end up going with, they were great, and they said, one important question is, how many transfers do you have? If they have a high number of hospital transfers, you might not want to do that. One of the things that they said was, if you had a previous birth, our transfer rate is almost 0%. That's very high, and that makes me, or very low, I guess, that makes me say, this might be it. And the other thing that I loved about them was everything is a conversation. When it comes to tests or how involved they're going to be, they are very much something that can be discussed. And I think that that's what's important, because especially when it comes to home births, I imagine home birth midwives, they do a lot less births than someplace at like a hospital or a birth center. So it's really a one-on-one relationship, or a one-on-two, one-on-three, depending on how many midwives you're working with. But you really want to be able to get along with them, have an open communication, have them learn about the birth that you want, and, be able to go with that. Now, the only other thing that I'll add is, over this past week, when I have been looking into different home birth options, I've learned about this thing called free birth, which I had never really heard about before, despite being a little bit hippy-dippy in a lot of my ways. But free birth is basically when you are birthing at home, or maybe even in the woods or somewhere else without midwives around, whether it just be your partner, or whether it just be, by yourself at the beach. It can be whatever you want to do. There are definitely risks to this, and especially if this is not your first birth. Most women that do this, they do it because they ideally would love to have a midwife, but either nobody's available, or nobody that they trust is around, or they just think, okay, you know what, I've done this before. I know what to expect. I can do it myself. That's not necessarily the best for me. I think that would actually be potentially fun, maybe for a third birth. My husband is definitely not down. He needs professionals available, especially. So I'm around to listen to them. So I don't think that we're going to go that way. There are definitely risks to that. So, I've heard about free births gone wrong too, where, you don't know anything's wrong and the baby dies because you don't know. So that's an option if you are interested in some kind of free birth scenario. I found a podcast, I think it's called Free Birthing. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll list it in the description. But it's basically all about these empowered women who decide to give birth on their own. And unfortunately, I won't be that empowered this time around, but I do look forward to having my baby at home and having it be much more along my terms, with hopefully people that I like and trust and can make my dream birth happen. The last thing I'll actually say is if you are looking into doing a home birth, especially this year because it's COVID, home birth midwives are getting inundated with new requests that they wouldn't have otherwise. So definitely call early. Try to talk to them sooner rather than later so you can get in if this is how you actually, or even considering how you want to give birth. If this was at all helpful, please hit like. If you want to hear more about my experience throughout my pregnancy or get healthy pregnancy tips, please subscribe. That's it for today. Thanks so much. Hope to see you again.